Marcus.
Hey,
Thank you for doing
Elaine.
this interview again.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
Yes. So today we're gonna talk about a different topic, right? Currently in our industry, there's a lot of different terminologies being thrown around, like user experience, customer experience, design thinking, digital transformation. I think today, because of your background, you have done a lot of different, roles that, I think you'll be a very good person to help, decipher and clear up the space a little bit. So maybe let's first start off by you introducing like your background and the various roles that you have been in the industry.
Sure. I think that would really help also just contextualize what we're trying to do to clarify these terms. So I started off way back when, trained as a product designer. So way before even the term UX, or in fact, the digital world had really started to become how we see it now. So my original training, as I said, was in product design. But very soon after my graduation, my work encompassed more than product design. My first title, in fact, was a creative director. So as opposed to working in a traditional product development role, as in an in-house product designer or perhaps a product designer in a industrial design firm, consultancy, so to speak, I ended up in a branding firm. So my work had already started to, I suppose, displace into a more cross-disciplinary role, managing designers from different disciplines. For example, architects, interior designers, visual merchandisers, and graphic designers, and perhaps touching a little bit on the digital realm. But regardless, is orchestrating a lot of different roles. But branding ultimately speaks more from the communication as well as the strategic positioning from the brand standpoint, from that company standpoint. So this is one era of my career, so to speak, that allowed me to see what happens in advertising, what happens in corporate identity development, both in the three-dimensional as well as the two-dimensional print world, then gradually into the digital world. That's one phase. And then another phase of it, I would say, where the transition was relatively imperceptible, was moving into then the user-centric approach to design. And this is where the words, for example, design thinking, as well as the words service design and UX design started to come into play. And if you think about also the geographic location, it went from New York to Sydney. From Sydney, then with clients like projects we've worked together before in Hong Kong, as well as Singapore, and then eventually moving to Shanghai. So in a way, it followed the trajectory of how, I suppose, the industry also evolved between all of these different design disciplines.
Can you describe a little bit about, because I remember when I sort of met you, it was in New York, and you were in the branding firm, right? And like Samsung was one of the projects. Like what was the transition between that and user-centered design? Like how did that happen?
Samsung is an interesting history because it literally paralleled the development of the brand in the international arena. Literally, I witnessed the birth of Samsung as a brand in North America when they literally went from OEM manufacturing, for example, they were building, in fact, microwave ovens for GE for the longest time. They were building digital, or not even digital, physical sound equipment for brands like RCA. Now, if you notice, GE probably went out of the microwave business a while back, and RCA went out of the business of the radio business a while back. This is all part of the history. And Samsung, in fact, had become then a brand on its own. In fact, went from way out of the top 50 brands league in the world to now firmly entrenched into the top 50 brands in the world. If you remember those days when we were in New York, Sony was the big Asian electronics brand. Yeah,
Uh-huh,
and see where they
uh-huh.
are now, right? So
Yeah.
that really illustrates that that trajectory in history, I think.
Right. That's actually an interesting history because Samsung was one of the first few Asian brands that made it internationally, right? And
Mm-hmm.
also China's trying to follow its footsteps.
Mm-hmm.
Also, a lot of Chinese brands.
Yes. Yes.
Um, but okay, let's go back to a lot of the confusing terms, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and then after that you went back to Sydney and
Yeah.
worked with One Center, right?
Yes. So the one center, I would say, is the imperceptible transition, because
Mm,
the one center called itself, and at the time positioned itself as a brand experience firm. So you
mm,
could see a bit of hybrid approach here is, whilst the DNA came from branding and advertising, so very communication centered, it's starting to recognize then the overall customer experience that is, I suppose, casted still from the lens of the brand, but at least it's basically under the belief that a brand orchestrates a multi-sensorial as well as a multi-touch point experience. So this
mm.
is where I suppose the brand world, and at least if we call the term customer experience term, and customer as a word very much came from the marketing world, you could imagine, as
Right.
opposed to user. And I think this is a really good springboard then to talk about UX, because
Yes.
even the word customer versus user is effectively two angles of seeing the same stakeholder, if you will,
Right. Right.
in the equation.
Can we maybe use an example? Because I know you worked
Mm-hmm.
for McDonald's and Audi. Can you use a real example to illustrate what's the difference between customer experience and user experience and how they interact with each other?
Sure. I would say, let me start with customer experience then. And I think customer experience usually, ironically, implies a broader term,
Mm-hmm.
because customer experience, and this is even to this day, there's a lot of confusion between what what the consumer sees the word customer experience versus how within the design profession the
Mm.
word customer experience is defined. So let me give you some examples, or let me illustrate the terms to start off with. Customer experience to me is really from the outside in, meaning it is channel and touch point agnostic.
Mm.
Really is every single touch point, be it your digital interface or the digital interface being embedded into a physical product,
Mm-hmm.
like your classic, mobile phone product, or even your car, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
mobile phone started off as a piece of electronics, whereas the car is a piece of hardware that is getting more sophisticated in terms of its user interface.
Yeah.
On the other side, customer experience also includes, and classic mistake by the regular consumer is the person who delivers the service. So for example, the basically the order taker at McDonald's, or the person behind the counter at McDonald's.
Mm.
Customer
Okay.
experience also includes the whole restaurant itself, the
Mm.
physical environment, right?
Right.
Whereas if we transition and talk about user experience, now this is where the confusion is starting to happen. And in fact, I did a bit of homework before our interview, looking at all the different possible definitions of the word UX, as
Mm.
well as UX design. And let's start with UX. UX, in fact, is at its broadest term, not that different from what I described in the last couple of minutes about customer experience.
Mm.
However, the more specific definition in UX design within the design profession, it's, to me, it's a bit more digital centric, and then it acknowledges the user context. So you start off with what's happening on the screen, but then you acknowledge then where, when, who, and how are these events happening around what's happening from the screen. So you know what
Right.
I mean by outside in versus inside out. Is it's more screen centric, but acknowledges the context and the
Mm.
surroundings and the people. Whereas when you talk about the full customer experience, is completely touch point agnostic, and you're surveying, basically we use the theater analogy a lot in customer experience, as in your stage, your story, your characters, your costumes, your lighting. You know, it really is very theoretical in the way it sees the series of events and how the physical and digital and all these different touch points orchestrate into one full story.
Is customer support also part of the customer experience?
Absolutely. To me, customer support is part of, in a way, the potentially the unhappy journey when things go wrong.
Right.
I'm not going to go into the word customer journey. That's a whole other, you know, level of
Right.
detail, but definitely customer support is part of the experience because it's about helping customers when the experience turns negative.
So if you look at it
Yeah.
that way, then actually customer experience includes, training operations, right? It's not necessarily just the design of it. It's a lot of, human resources planning and training,
Operational human
right?
resources. So another analogy we could talk about is customer experience. And I
Mm-hmm.
think might be the right time to talk about also service design, which
Mm.
is one of the definitions that has, is not really entered a lot of corporate jargon, for better or worse. I would say the most direct relationship is service design delivers customer experience.
Mm-hmm.
And service design also has the component of what we call the front of stage, what is facing the customer.
Mm.
And then there is the back of stage, which is basically everything that happens behind the curtain that enables this customer experience to be delivered. So that includes the operation, that includes the HR, that includes the standard operating procedures, that happens, basically describes a lot of things that requires people or digital solutions or the physical environment that all orchestrates to deliver that experience.
Right. Yeah. And traditionally, I understand that service design actually came from the UK, right? Because they don't have manufacturing anymore. They kind of moved up to service design. And,
Mm-hmm.
when it kind of trickled to Asia, I remember when we were working on the post office project, I remember
Yeah,
like day one when the post office manager, we were trying to do service design, not
yeah,
just interior design, right? I think the
yes.
first question he said is, am I going to be fired? you know,
Mm-hmm.
because a redesigning of the service could affect people's jobs,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So in your experience, how does, being a design role, how does that interact with like, the human operations planning and headcounts and all that?
I would say this is where it absolutely needs to take touch on the HR function of any
Mm,
company. Because when we work on service design, inevitably we are going to be impacting the role not only of the people who are delivering the service. In
mm,
fact, to give you an example, the banking industry, it's even about defining whether it's one branch at every location that provides the same level of service. A
mm,
great example of that, if you imagine, is certain, I would say, like even food and beverage establishments,
mm-hmm,
right? Fast food area, they may have a main brand full service location, but they may
mm-hmm,
have an express location that only deals with on the road delivery. Pizza
mm.
is a great example if you think about it, because they have a delivery as well as an eat-in restaurant
Right,
component. And then the express branch only delivers. It's got no seating for customers.
right.
So you're even looking at different tiers of physical doors or locations. Of course, the job
Mm.
description of the people who run it would be very different as well.
So when you do the design, do you have to kind of
Yeah.
calculate the ROI of, you know, the different ways of servicing the customer?
I would say where it then marries into, to a degree, it does. When we talk about service design, there is a role within the service design team that is very valuable. It's called the business designer. And the
Mm-hmm,
business designer, in fact, is someone who understands the service design and the customer facing implication of that design. But at the
mm-hmm,
same time, they are the ones who start then basically designing the operational and therefore potentially the business model that may be impacted as well. So in a way, they work on the dollar and cents as well as time budgeting, and therefore the various different human roles that it requires to operate this service experience. So yes, absolutely, there is such a role, and sometimes service design may touch on it just at a fairly, I suppose, surface level, but sometimes service design also touches pretty deeply on the operational model.
Right. So would you say, the business designer usually has a business background, right? And versus the service design would more have a design background?
I would say so, because they are different sides of a coin. The service designer would be more accustomed and thinking in terms of the actual customer, as well as the psychology of the customer. The business designer needs to understand more deeply in both operational models and then what are the implications to the actual business model itself.
Right.
And therefore, what sort of skills it needs to operate to support this outward customer experience, the front of stage.
Yes. So previously you mentioned that customer experience is, it's sort of related to marketing as well, right? So how does the service designer's role kind of overlap or not with marketing roles?
Okay, that's a really good question. And that to me is a question of the level of maturity of that company. Historically, the marketing is a far more entrenched role in a lot of companies, right? And therefore their foothold into the company, their position in the company is far clearer. But if you look at it from a customer standpoint, there is no doubt that marketing sets up a promise and a certain expectation for customers before they even, in fact, experience the service itself. In very simple terms, the service designer picks up then at the very beginning of the delivery of that service of the customer. So one side sets up the expectation, the other side fulfills that expectation. In very simple terms, this is where the more mature companies are very aware of that linkage. The less mature companies would still see these as very siloed activities, and the gap between expectation being set up and the level of refinement and the level of delivery of service, does it fall short or does it actually fulfill the promise well?
Right. Would you describe, for, the companies that you've worked for, does marketing understand what service design or the design role does, or they treat designer as just making things prettier, or?
Again, it's by progression. You've described probably the less mature state whereby marketing sits in a very different silo from people delivering the experience. I think at a next level of maturity, there will be a realization that marketing sets up that expectation, but but it's still marketing dominant, and then the experience follows, right? And then at the more mature state, the third state is when the two sides, in fact, start occupying more of an equal position, whereby marketing informs the experience design. Experience design also needs to inform marketing. In fact, this is where the company might even be questioning, besides delivering a really great and the ideal customer experience, which part of our customer experience becomes the most marketable? That is the sign. You know what I mean? It's like you are thinking about both what really benefits the customer, but you could also think about at an earlier stage, how do you start communicating that to the customer, and therefore starts instigating that behavior change and getting it into the customer's head before they even get used to, start experiencing that service, which is a really sort of sign that the pivot had happened. That it's not only about marketing telling the rest of the team that we are setting up all these promises, you deliver it for me. it's going the other way around, right? And
Right.
then when we look at the fourth state of maturity, I would say is I have literally come across company where the chief experience officer actually has customer experience and marketing under their umbrella. And therefore
Mm.
they see this as an absolute continuum that the silos are beginning to fall away at a structural level in the company.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like from the traditionally from the user experience world,
Mm-hmm.
um, the way you come up with, even product, features or requirements is
Yeah.
you start from ethnography and understanding user needs, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes through that process, marketing ideas come out, right?
Yes.
So like who's who starts when and who stops when, it's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's very, very hard to draw the line. And to me, the ideal state is you need to start from both ends.
Mm,
And flipping to the side of the coin of the user side is then the next lens from my own brand background, I would say is you need to be aware of what is the brand equity? What is the brand known in the market for? Where are the strengths of this brand that makes this new service credible and
mm,
legitimate? You know what I
right.
mean? Like there is that brand lens. You can't deny that you can't design a service and then wrap it with a surface, wrap it with a nice skin. That's the brand. That is a
Mm,
very siloed way of looking at things.
right.
But on the other side, it's also starting from the brand side, then figuring out what the surface is. Somehow these two ends need to meet in the middle.
Right.
And in a way, both sides, and this is where we think that T shape is really important, is on the top side, the horizontal side of the T, in the most advanced state, you need to be constantly going between the customer centric and the brand centric angle. And the two
Mm,
sides need to keep, in a way, questioning and challenging each other. To me, that is a really ideal state because you're tackling the problem from both sides. But on the other side, you've got the legs of the T being marketing. You've got digital design. You've got physical design. You've even got basically human service design. All of those things, which in a way are the traditional silos within the company, but you've got the overall experiential design and brand experience design and all of those terms, in fact, unifying the four from up the top.
mm. Yeah, I guess something more, you know, uh, solid for people to imagine what the hell we're
Yeah,
talking about is, for example,
yeah, yeah,
McDonald's, right? McDonald's have these like interactive kiosks, that, it's
yes,
like a recent thing, right? So, and also there's like McCafe versus like the traditional lining up for your fish burger, right?
yes,
So that, um, so when we describe like the customer experience, we're talking about the entire experience, right? And
absolutely.
yeah, and then the user experience would, in your understanding, is more the digital side of things, where would it be like the kiosk interaction, or is
Yes, I
that?
would say, okay, now probably is a good time to talk about the difference between, I suppose for UX people, the distinction between UI and UX is relatively clear, right? The UI is what happens in the kiosk, basically all the hand gestures as well as the size of the photography, where the button's placed.
Mm-hmm.
And then UX starts to think about, oh, in the physical kiosk, we have a credit card paying point. We may have another point that's based off of QR whereby the customer has already paid on their
Mm-hmm.
app already. There's another point in the case of Hong Kong, the octopus card or various different instant, basically RFID, the radio frequency based, instant cash card based payment system. Already there are 3 different physical interfaces that allows the customer to pay in 3 different ways. That is
Mm-hmm.
beginning to get into the UX part because it's not only what happens on the screen,
Yeah.
but it's in fact how does the customer physically integrate with with the object being the you know being the overall kiosk itself. Then if
Right.
you look at it even in a bigger sense, when we talk about customer experience is I have to work with an architect in figuring out the queuing space for the
Mm.
customer in front of the kiosk, I
Mm.
have to make sure that line doesn't interfere with the line of people lining up at the pickup counter.
Mm-hmm.
The architect's work is pretty hard there. Also predicting peak times, queuing, crowd management system,
Right.
managing the flow of people within the restaurant itself. That is beginning to look into the larger physical space. So we're talking inside out now. What happens on the screen? What happens on the kiosk? What
Yep.
happens in the architecture of the restaurant? Then we might even have to figure out, okay, how do we prevent people from queuing up all the way to the car park or the street and therefore being trapped in the heat outside, not
Yes.
in air conditioning?
Mhm.
So you could see all these lenses getting bigger as well. And that is the full customer experience. In fact, that might pick up back into the digital experience in the sense that service design thinks about the customer being on the car, on their
Mhm.
app, pre-ordering their burgers. If we
Mhm.
landed back into that source, it's digital to physical back to digital. It's
Yes.
super interesting because it is a multi-touch point orchestration of experience at the end.
Right. And
Yeah,
then coming back to design thinking,
yeah,
we were describing the T.
yeah.
The T is a T-shaped, education or T-shaped model people, right? Where you
As well
have
as
the
T-shaped organization, in fact.
yes,
Yeah.
where you have the domain expertise in one, whether
Mm-hmm.
you are industrial design or
Yeah.
architect or visual design, and then the cross is
Yeah.
cross departmental, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or cross discipline. Can you explain how that relates to service design and UX and all
Okay.
these
I,
confusing
I
terminologies?
would say out of all the terms we talked about, the most broad and most, I guess, meta term would be design thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Because design thinking is a general philosophy that, in fact, every other designer has been educated in, and that is starting with the user, deeply
Mm-hmm.
understanding their needs, and then defining where our design challenges are in the traditional design world that would result in a design brief.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go about then ideating and creating the concepts. Then we
Mm-hmm.
go and test the concepts through prototyping.
Mm-hmm.
So every designer would understand, okay, if I'm designing a user interface, it might be a paper prototype first, and then a clickable screen prototype. On the physical world, we might even be doing a cardboard mock-up in scale of a building, and then we
Mm-hmm.
build it in a warehouse in one-to-one scale so people could walk into that. That's the prototyping stage, and then testing it and going back to the loop. Design thinking is effectively the major steps that I have described, whether you are designing an entire system of like an airport operation, as broad as that, as a system between digital and physical, I guess digital and physical touch points, all the way down to designing for one screen, literally to the
Mm.
UI, something that is very, very specific. Design thinking, in fact, it's going through the same steps, just at different scales.
Right. How would you
Yeah.
describe that is different from traditional design, like traditional industrial designs, for example?
I would say traditional industrial design, and maybe I'm speaking of a very antiquated definition, is the designer in the old days would pick up from the ideation stage
Mm.
because their marketing or their product planning department would have come up with the product brief already,
Mm-hmm.
pretty clearly defining what is the intended market for this product, and then the
Mm.
intended user, and then what is the feature set, or what are the different functions that this product needs to embody. At best, if you have a product line, you have the most super deluxe down to the most basic model. What is the feature mix? And then
Mm.
the product designer gives form, gives
Mm-hmm.
physical embodiment to this concept.
Mm-hmm.
So the product designer picks up from a much more tactical and much more detailed phase,
Yeah.
and would be working with, for example, engineers to make that happen.
Right.
Whereas in our newer definition of design, the designer in fact questions, are we designing this as a toaster? Is toaster the best solution for it? You know, in the broader lens,
Right.
is there another way to make toast? I often say that is the broader definition that we could go with.
Yeah. So in a way,
Yeah.
designer's role kind of advanced in the totem pole, right? And became a little bit more strategic than historical definition of
Yeah.
aesthetics type of designer, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And and you know, even in UX,
Yeah.
it's actually quite interesting. A lot of times, like UX is put next to slash UI.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's like architect slash interior designer, right? You know, like it's sort of lumped together to quite different levels of things
Yeah.
into one, right?
Yeah.
What is your experience in how, for example, especially in Hong Kong and China, like how companies understand these terms?
In many cases, especially in, I guess, smaller firms where the definition of roles are less
Mm-hmm.
clear cut,
Mm,
right? In a lot of small to medium sized businesses, people have to wear many different hats anyway.
right.
And that adds to the confusion because you really literally, out of the various different terms and roles that I described, you might have one person who's doing
Yeah.
all three
Yeah.
or all
Huh.
four of them, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is thereby lies the confusion is it, and we've talked about this before. Then you end up with job description that are complete unicorns or complete
Yes.
camels, I should say, not unicorns, more like camels, because they in fact are embodying so many different roles that would be very difficult for one person to fulfill, or at
Mm,
the very least to fulfill well equally at every
mm-hmm.
aspect of that role.
Right.
The moment you start getting into larger organizations, then the roles get more clear cut, the job
Mm,
descriptions get more clear cut, but
right.
still there are confusion at an organizational or departmental level that a lot of companies are still going through in transitioning their basic structures.
Right.
Yeah.
So lastly, for example, I know, especially in Hong Kong, there's a lot of talk about digital
Mm-hmm.
transformation, you
Yeah.
know, and a lot of them hire UX designers. Can you describe a little bit about that, especially if you've worked for companies like Accenture, Fjord, right? Where I'm sure like banks or insurance companies are coming to, you know, those management consultancy companies for digital transformation. So what
Yeah.
exactly does that do?
Okay, usually maybe I could give you a bit of an archetypal story with the digital transformation client. You
Yeah.
know, I'm not talking specific industries or specific client brands, but in a lot of consultancy situation is the moment a customer approaches a company like a Fjord that is already getting an understanding of there is a difference between UX and service design.
Mm,
But in early days, if I could perhaps go backwards and recede in time by a couple of years earlier, client companies might come to a consulting or digital design firm at the very least to say, we need an app, we need a website.
mm-hmm.
The next question being asked is, what is the role of your app? What is the role of your website? What is it supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
Please don't tell me that every other company has a website and an app and therefore you need one. That's not a good enough answer.
Mm-hmm.
So to a degree, the definition of the role of the website and the app. And then next question then would be what sort of components are your website? What are the different sections within your website, or what are the functions and buttons in your app? So that's still speaking from in a way, a product-centric sense.
Mm,
That is the
right.
early phase of digital transformation, I would say, is
Mm-hmm.
those sort of questions would be on the table. And those
Right.
sort of the content would be on the design brief.
Yeah.
Next phase, now that companies have maybe put an app or a website out in the market for a couple of years, and then they start realizing there are sections of it that never gets used. There are sections of it that customers use all the time, but the experience is not great. So the call center ends up becoming a troubleshooting spot where customers call them for technical support all the time, whether
Mm,
they like it or not.
right.
In a very practical sense, this is where then the conversation around then experience design, the conversation around service design, even without such a term, might start surfacing, because then you're realizing one touch point being the website or the app is beginning to trouble another touch point like a call center, because the call center becomes the catch-all for all customer frustrations, right? Then the company needs to take a more holistic look. And I'm only talking from a customer standpoint. There are many of these cases whereby even the staff are complaining, like a relationship manager at a bank or a cabin crew in an airline that is beginning to then basically suffer from all the consequences of what is not being well integrated between physical and digital touch points.
I see.
Right? So this is a really practical and real archetypal story of what happens. Then the word and the definition of UX and digital transformation is beginning to get questioned into a larger lens of service design and design thinking.
Right. So lastly, just to wrap up, what kind of skills are required to, especially to do service design, let's say?
I would say never neglect on the one side the core skill that you as a professional person trying to get into the field. We were talking earlier on, say, if you were in digital marketing, treasure that skill, because that is a native skill that enables you to navigate the marketing world to begin with. And it's probably not unwise to choose a firm when you get into the profession of UX that is closer to digital marketing, for example. But then I'm speaking about the vertical subject matter expertise of that specific industry,
T-shape.
for example, the T-shape, right?
Yeah.
But when we talk about the horizontal shape, then it would be worthwhile getting an understanding of how this organization is structured. How do different departments, in fact, work or don't work with each other? Where is my role fitting in within these different silos? How does it, what is the process? Say if you end up in the design department, ask the question, do they interact with marketing? If so, how do they do it? At what point do I get a creative brief? Do I have any opportunity to influence the creative brief or the design brief before the design brief gets executed, before I pick up that ball and run with it? At what point do I get involved into the writing of the brief process, if you will? So it's really understanding at an organizational level and from a process level, how does this organization work? How mature it is, and how am I going to fit into the big picture? Am I fitting into the picture in a very tactical, very executional role, or do I get the opportunity to get involved at a slightly more strategic part of the process? Is there a more strategic part of the process? Maybe HQ in another country has already given us the strategy. If I'm walking into a company that's, in its Hong Kong branch is carrying out a much more sales and marketing role, and I have much less opportunity. I'm basically executing the local manifestation of an internationally determined overall strategy for it already. Be aware of all of those implications.
So I would say, the moral of the story is, the job seekers should really not just look at the term, but understand what the term means from that company, from the company hiring, right? Like ask questions on what does this role do? Where am I in the process? Am I involved in strategic or tactical, so that you're not attracted to the term and then found out that later that you land in a job that is something that what you didn't want to do in the first place. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, for lack of a better term, me being an interviewee in front of an HR and in front of a design team in the company, you're kind of doing ethnography with the company, by probing. On paper, this is the JD that I received from HR. But when I'm asking about the process of the company, and when I'm asking about who am I reporting to, You know, I'm asking about who am I receiving this information from? You're probing, in fact, what is the reality of the picture? What is the gap between that JD and the reality of that company? And therein lies the difference, is identifying those gaps and whether those gaps are in fact realistic, whether those gaps are in fact risky for me to in fact become part of in a way,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
When you're interviewing for that job.
Great. That
Yeah,
is going to be very, very helpful, I think, to our audience to
hopefully.
learn from your background. Okay, thank you so much, Marcus. And
You're very
yeah,
welcome, Elaine.
yeah, I think they'll learn a lot from this. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Remember to like, subscribe, and share our video so more people can understand how to get into the UX industry.